Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is David Goodhart. David is the author of the very influential book The Road to Somewhere, in which he talked about what he calls the new tribes of Britain, the people from somewhere and the people from anywhere. And he's now followed that with Head, Hand and Heart, developing some of these themes further. And I think I'm right in saying Head, Hand and Heart is just out in paperback? Anyway, welcome David to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, there's a number of things we could talk about, and I'm sure we'll get round to a lot of them. I'm very keen to talk about the head, hand, heart analysis of your latest book and the problems and the dissatisfactions of each of the groups that you identify. Before we do that, I'd just like to talk a bit about an article you wrote and which resonated with me very strongly at the time, which you wrote in Prospect magazine, and that's the article called Reflections of a Referendum Fence-Sitter. So I guess my basic question is, now that the referendum has taken place, which side of the fence seems best to you? And did we make a terrible mistake, or is it all turning out okay?
No, I don't think we made a terrible mistake. I mean, I did come off the fence and I voted Remain, I think, for largely small C Conservative reasons. Actually, that's one of the odd things about the whole Brexit vote, is that both sides really voted for small C Conservative reasons.
Yes.
And yet it's seen as this incredibly radical step. I certainly was one of those Remainers, perhaps because I was a Remainer who had a fair amount of sympathy for the Leavers. I was kind of sort of 55, 45 Remainer. So I was definitely one of those Remainers who thought that we should respect the vote. And I suppose after all this kind of faffing around of the Theresa May period, I did sort of come round to the view that if we are going to leave, we might as well leave fully and properly. So I didn't find myself objecting particularly to leaving the customs union and the single market in the way that we have. Clearly that was going to have costs, but if part of this is about democratic accountability and reclaiming the sovereignty that is required really to be a proper living democracy, I think, particularly looking ahead at the kind of issues that the European Union is going to face, it is going to have to become less democratic in the way that we normally use the word. So I think, there probably could have been cleverer ways of doing it, kind of Norway options and so on. But I think we probably, in the end, did the right thing by leaving in a pretty radical way, really. And clearly, we're only kind of at the beginning of the process. It'll throw up all sorts of unexpected and difficult things, no doubt, and we're already seeing that a little bit. Although, of course, it's been convenient in some ways not just from the point of view of the government, but as it were from the point of view of the whole Brexit experience, that it has overlapped with COVID, and it is very difficult to disentangle the negative effects of COVID on trade with the European Union from Brexit effects. And, like I say, all sorts of things are suddenly being thrown up, like the difficulty that the performers and artists and so on are having. But again, that would have been much sharper, I guess, if not COVID. And then putting a more benign and positive gloss on the whole experience, of course, is the vaccine story, which I think probably technically we could have done much of what we did in the vaccine field and remained in the European Union. But it becomes a really very advantageous narrative in some ways, underlining the benefits of being more autonomous and nimble. And I think it does also underline, again, part of the point of Brexit and part of the problem of an institution like the European Union is that it has to kind of, by definition, sort of homogenize differences between countries. And one of the important differences between countries is their different attitude to and appetite for risk. And, Anglo-Saxon countries are traditionally seen as a little bit more kind of risk-friendly than, say, Germanic or Scandinavian countries, particularly in the post-war period anyway. And I think that has been borne out in some ways by the vaccine experience. I mean, Kate Bingham's vaccine organisation took some very big risks. It took out some big bets, and quite a few of them won. We then took the kind of riskier path in some ways, or the not completely certain path of we bet on the reliability of just having one jab, at least for a pretty long period of time, that one jab would give sufficient protection. That gamble seems to have paid off as well. And the continental Europeans were mainly much more sceptical about that, but now seem to be following in our footsteps. So, I mean, taking the whole of the sort of last few months together in the immediate Brexit period, I certainly don't have regrets. I think this is, I certainly don't have regrets about supporting, once we'd voted to leave, supporting us leaving. I mean, it's not something I've studied in very close detail, and I'm sure there could have been cleverer ways of doing it, but I think probably a somewhat deeper and cleaner break was going to be necessary, and I think has probably, there would have been much more kind of lingering dissatisfaction on the Brexit side if we hadn't gone the whole way, as it were. And actually, in some ways, I mean, Remainers have been so surprisingly, I mean, having been very noisy in the period from the vote itself right through to last year, the kind of Remain voice seems relatively muted, and I think a lot of Remain voters. I mean, I think the majority of both Brexit and Remain voters are the sort of people that accept democratic decisions. They may not particularly like something, they may not have done it themselves, but that's what's been decided, and they go along with it. I mean, the moderate Brexiteer and the moderate Remainer are probably not that far apart in many of their, even the moderate Remainers, by the standards of most other European countries, are pretty Eurosceptic.
Yeah. And,
there's some interesting, I saw some interesting opinion data the other day on how Remainers have now accepted that that free movement is no longer. I mean, they kind of and accept the kind of logic and reasoning behind that, while Brexiteers, for their part, are much less anxious about immigration in general.
It does seem peculiar that, because I suspect that many of the problems that Brexiteers have with immigration are probably not inside the EU, although you do say in your book, The Road to Somewhere, that the biggest problem for Brexit, or one of the greatest causes for Brexit, was the influx of immigration from the EU. But my sort of thought to that is that, and maybe this is purely from my own prejudices talking, is that immigration from the EU is unlikely to give rise to huge cultural changes, whereas immigration from the rest of the world, particularly from the Islamic countries, is much more culturally awkward, if I can put it like that.
Well, that is true, but I think that's already happened, as it were. That's already sort of baked in. The problems of segregation and division in the kind of mill towns and so on. It is a real issue. Although I think maybe it's been that issue has been relatively quiet for a while, which doesn't mean to say that it's not still a problem in certain parts of the country. Because Muslims do, on average, at least the Muslims in Britain who mainly come from quite traditional backgrounds, 2 or 3 generations back in Pakistan or Bangladesh, tend to live somewhat more separately than most of the other big minorities in the UK. Tend to be more religiously pious, tend to live at a bit more of an angle, as it were, to kind of mainstream norms. But I think I don't think one should underestimate the issue with East Europeans, just because of the quantity and the degree of change to neighbourhoods. When 1.5 million people come within whatever it was, a sort of 3 or 4 year period, when you're expecting 15,000 a year. I mean, it was partly that too. I mean, the kind of the misalignment of expectation and reality. it just kind of underlined to people. I mean, most people don't notice the technicalities of European Union membership, and then suddenly it was very much drawn to people's attention that we didn't control a really fundamental thing about a nation state is controlling who can be a member of it. Who can be a fellow citizen, who can come and I think most people hadn't realised that was part of the EU story. Indeed, it hadn't been really part of the EU story from the beginning, or at least free movement was in the Treaty of Rome, but it was much more circumscribed until quite recently. I mean, it had been opened and opened and opened in various steps over recent years. I think it's the sort of transactional notion. I mean, a lot of East Europeans, perfectly reasonably enough, would sort of come here and work for a few months and then go home, come back. That sense that unlike people who come from poorer, the kind of more traditional, the first wave, as it were, of post-war immigration to Britain, overwhelmingly people from Commonwealth countries, overwhelmingly non-white people from Commonwealth countries. And of course, that there were frictions. We know the whole history. There were frictions, and those frictions remain to some extent. I mean, we were just talking about the kind of the Milltown issue, but there's absolutely no question that those people were British. They'd come here and they were digging roots. They were creating new forms of sort of hybrid Britishness, and that wasn't the case often with people who were coming here under the free movement rules. It was a much more transactional relationship with a country, and I think that made people feel uneasy. Of course, some East European groups, have somewhat analogous to first wave post-war immigration have stayed and settled. I mean, Poles perhaps particularly. I think Poles are now one of the second or third biggest sort of ethno-national group in the UK, and they are integrating, I think, pretty successfully. But there are some of the poorer East Europeans, Bulgarians, Romanians, often keep themselves to themselves, don't really integrate, live in their own worlds.
Yes, it's interesting you say that. I know lots of Polish immigrants. I don't know any Bulgarian or Romanian immigrants, so that's quite telling, maybe.
Always like a class divide almost within the kind of East European world. But yeah, I think it was a very big factor, and and you could say, well, and that's actually in some ways quite a good thing, because it suggests that it's not to do with race. It really is to do with lack of familiarity. Suddenly your neighbourhood changes quite significantly, and the streets fill up with people speaking Bulgarian or Romanian, and their shops open, and you don't necessarily feel any hostility, certainly not any sort of racist hostility to them. You just feel a discomfort at that degree of change from a group of people with whom you struggle to find anything in common with. You don't even have a common language in many cases.
I do agree that immigration, for whatever reason, seems to have dropped off the agenda almost completely, as far as I can tell. And I would admit that I'm maybe not the best person to judge it, but I just don't hear about it or read about it or see anything about it. But oddly enough, and sort of paradoxically, race has shot up the agenda. And do you I don't know if this is particularly a field which you have anything you can reflect in your work or not, but is that your impression as well?
It certainly has. I mean, I think the interesting question is, to what extent this is a blip relating to George Floyd and events in America and Black Lives Matter, almost a kind of lockdown sort of racial blip, or whether it does speak to something deeper. I mean, in many ways, it's, and I've written about this, I sort of see it as a kind of growing pain in some ways, because if you stand back and look at the data, look at the story more broadly in this country, it's really a pretty successful one, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years. If you look at the education story, almost all ethnic minority groups now do better than the white average, certainly in compulsory schooling. We've seen, certain groups do hugely better in the economy too. British Indians, particularly British Indians and British Chinese, outstrip the white average in pay and indeed in membership of the top social class. The top social class, by the way, 16% visible ethnic minority, and I think just under 13% white British. So there is movement into the elite as well, into the profession, the kind of higher professional class.
I didn't understand when you said in your book, I was very struck by it. You said that the Chinese are outperforming. And I was just thinking, I am not aware of any Chinese people in public life in Britain that I can think of. I can think of many other ethnic minorities, but not Chinese people. So what are the professions that they are moving into?
Yeah, that is a good and interesting question. They have relatively low public visibility, you're right. I think that is probably true of Chinese minorities throughout the world. There is at least one British Chinese MP. But you're right, indeed. I was talking to somebody the other day who's setting up a British Chinese sort of think tank to sort of promote both the interests of and I think the visibility of the British Chinese community. And actually, another interesting thing. It was something else I was doing the other day. I was looking at. I was just saying how relatively good the story is when it comes to education, when it comes to employment, pay, and so on. It's not universally good, and there are some groups that are still lagging. And the reasons for that are not always, of course, just to do with, they may include, but they're not just about discrimination. They're also about, obviously, different groups have different histories, different educational outcomes, different class backgrounds, and so on. Some groups do better than others for, in part for cultural reasons, and but there is a less good story, as you would expect in some ways, when it comes to wealth as opposed to income. When it comes to what people earn in the labour market, you can, the kind of immigrant optimism, immigrant aspiration can very quickly project groups into kind of a position of having really good outcomes in the education system, and that translates pretty quickly into getting into good, well-paid jobs. It doesn't translate quite so quickly into acquiring wealth, and obviously in this country you acquire wealth mainly through property, through home ownership. And interestingly enough, the Chinese, although they've sort of catapulted themselves right up to the top of the ethnic pay scale, rather lag when it comes to property acquisition. And conversely, the British Pakistanis, who continue to lag in terms of pay, do very well in terms of property ownership. I think that's that may be partly the historic residue of discrimination against certain groups in terms of access to public housing when they first arrived in the 50s and the 60s. I think it was also due to the fact there was a lot of very cheap private housing to be had in places like Bradford, and Pakistani families often bought sort of 2 or 3 houses together and knocked them together in those sorts of places. So they now come out pretty high on the wealth and property spectrum, way ahead of the Chinese. Curiously, who do far better in all other outcomes, educational and occupational and income and so on. But that's just a bit of a curiosity, I think.
I wonder if the Chinese slightly more concerned to be mobile, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. I suspect they're not very heavily represented in public rented housing, so they will be overwhelmingly probably private renting, possibly from Chinese landlords. So it may be partly a kind of intra. Yeah, there may be some sort of cultural reasons for the Chinese not having acquired a huge amount of property wealth. While, belying the fact that they are doing so well in other respects.
It's odd. Okay, shall we move on to your book, Head, Hand, Heart, then? So do you want to talk a little bit about your groups and maybe start with Head?
Yeah. Obviously, the sort of thesis of the book is sort of in the title, really. And the argument is simple enough that we've allocated too much reward and esteem, not so much to kind of intelligence. I mean, the word intelligence is a very slippery one, but to a certain kind of intelligence, the kind of analytical, cognitive, academic, if you like, exam passing kind of intelligence, which is obviously absolutely essential. And I mean, one thing I do want to stress, because it's something that people can get the wrong end of the stick on. Obviously, I'm not anti-intelligence. We need, as a country, as a human race, we need high intelligence as never before. We've had a marvelous example of the usefulness of scientific academic intelligence in the vaccine, the extraordinary speed in which groups of incredibly clever people, teams of incredibly clever people cooperating mainly across national boundaries have come up with vaccines for COVID far, far quicker than most people expected. It's a great triumph of human intelligence and ingenuity. But that in itself is no justification for sending 50% of school leavers into academic courses at universities that they may not be particularly interested in or suited for. And I think one has to remember that new knowledge is created by a tiny, tiny proportion of people. You don't need to. You don't get more new knowledge by sending more and more kids to university. Essentially,
two things I've seen about that, but one of it is that the number of researchers in the world is going through the roof, but the rate of new discoveries and the rate of scientific progress is, if anything, the rate is actually declining.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there is no. I mean, there was a justification for expanding higher education, for placing more emphasis on and perhaps giving somewhat greater reward to, particularly given the kind of long training periods that are often required for cognitive professional jobs. There was a justification, and there remains a justification, obviously, for that. But there was a great period of expansion of jobs of those kinds in the 60s, 70s, 80s, perhaps into the 90s too. You had the growth of the so-called knowledge economy, decline of manufacturing, growth of sort of lots of sort of supplementary services, like marketing and so on. And you also had, and people sometimes forget this, you had big expansions of the welfare state. This is true across most European countries, most rich countries. Big expansions of the welfare state as society got richer. And we forget just how many sort of professional cognitive jobs the welfare state requires. You're expanding your health service. The health service employs a huge number of cognitive professionals, whether in the medical field or in all the various professions related to medicine. And nursing now is a graduate-only profession, although that's quite recent.
You seem to quite support that in your book, that nursing should become graduate.
Well, I mean, I cite the one or two pieces of evidence that suggest that having more graduate nurses is good for health outcomes in hospitals. But what I'm really on the other side of the argument in many ways. I mean, I'm very hostile to graduate-only professions. I think it's exactly a step in the wrong direction. I think it's mainly the self-interest of higher education itself, combined with professional lobbies who have, I think, a kind of misguided view of the benefit of academic education. I think, quite on the contrary, it's really, really important. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with the fact that I think about a third of police officers are now graduates. That's probably quite a good thing for all sorts of reasons, many of them perfectly obvious. Graduates tend to be more liberal-minded than non-graduates. So, given the sort of history of the police force, particularly in relation to ethnic minorities, to having a bigger graduate proportion of police officers is a good thing. But I think the idea that the police force should be graduate only, is a very damaging notion. And similarly with nursing too. I mean, it's the only is the key word there. I think it's a good thing that there are more graduate nurses. It should not be graduate only. And this is just common sense. Lots of very capable and very intelligent people don't do very well at exams at the age of 18 or 19. They're busy doing other things. They don't have the patience. They don't they don't have the application at that age. But they then develop, and we've got to leave open the door for other routes into these what we might call kind of everyday professions, not the kind of classical professions of sort of medicine and law and so on. But we have to leave open the door in the everyday professions to people who want to climb that ladder later on. Now, clearly, they've got to acquire the qualifications necessary for the job. But you don't always, you don't have to do them at university, or certainly don't have to do them at university at the age of 18 or 19. So long as there are other routes into these everyday professions, I think that's fine. And having a higher proportion of people with university degrees is not in itself a bad thing. But I think overall, there was a good reason to expand higher education in the way that we did back in the 80s and the 90s. I think we've now, as I say in my book, we've reached peak head. We're now overproducing. The university system and indeed politics itself in this respect, I think, is on automatic pilot. But you just have to look at the data, look at what is happening to graduates, look at what is happening to the occupational structure. I was looking at the figures the other day. The top two social classes, essential professional and managerial class, higher and lower, back in the year 2000, perhaps a surprisingly large proportion, perhaps, of the adult population, 35% of working adults were in the top two social classes. Last year, the figure had barely changed. 20 years later, it had gone up to 37%. So it's still growing very slightly. And that's still a lot of people, who need professional qualifications of one kind or another, not necessarily university degrees, although in many cases it'll be university degrees. But the idea that, far too much of our education policy, our social mobility policy, even our economic policy is based on the assumption that higher professional cognitive functions are going to go on growing. Well, they're not. If anything, they've probably stopped. I think they will. In years to come, they're going to go into reverse, because don't forget that artificial intelligence is mainly coming not so much for manual jobs. It's coming still, I guess, for some manual jobs. But automation over the last 20 or 30 years has mainly been eliminating manual jobs. But over the next 20 or 30 years, artificial intelligence is going to be mainly eliminating the kind of middle and lower rung cognitive jobs. In accountancy, in law, in medicine, in administration.
So what are these people going to do?
There are going to be millions of things for them to do still, but they are... So that is part of the point of my peak head idea, is that we've stopped producing those kind of middle-class professional jobs. It's certainly in the numbers that we were in an earlier period, and that our whole kind of modern university system was sort of geared up to provide. But we still have a huge demand for there's a massive problem of the so-called missing middle. So it's the kind of technical jobs, maintenance jobs. Modern society is run, it requires a huge amount of kit to make it work. And that kit needs to be maintained by people. And that it doesn't necessarily require a university degree, although a university degree may not harm. It requires the old, what used to be the kind of HND, HNC style, sort of higher technical qualifications, the kinds of things that electricians are required to, kind of skills that electricians are required to know in order to practice as an electrician. And that is where we have a huge shortage, because so many of the people, the children of the people who used to do HNDs and HNCs have gone to university instead. That's not always a bad thing. I mean, if they're people who are really intellectually capable or intellectually curious, then they should go to university. But it's become far too automatic, I think, it's been completely, higher education has set back social mobility, quite contrary to what most people claim about it, because it's been completely dominated by the middle and upper middle classes, with a fair number of people from the lower middle class and the working class also, invited to climb the ladder because it's seen as the road to safety and success. Well, it increasingly isn't, and it's particularly the case that those people from less privileged backgrounds who might be going to university for the first in their family, they're the ones who are forming the bulk of I think it's 35% of graduates who are not in graduate employment 5 to 10 years after graduating. The so-called graduate income premium has fallen off a cliff, I think, for particularly those who don't go to elite universities. And that is creating a great deal of discontent. The kind of crisis of disappointed expectations. I think the overexpansion, the automatic pilot that the university system is on, the conveyor belt is, and particularly with the pandemic, more kids than ever are going to university, and I think a lot of them are going to suffer this crisis of disappointed expectations. They have been led to believe that working hard, passing your exams, getting into the A-level stream school and going on to university is the road to safety and success. And it will turn out for many of them that it isn't. And the market signals are already telling people that actually you can earn a great deal more, partly because of good old supply and demand. I mean, scarcity, because there is such scarcity in the so-called missing middle technical level. I mean, incomes in those areas are shooting upwards.
Do you think that's going to be assisted now that we've left the EU, and so there may be less immigration of the technical classes from European countries?
Yeah, I certainly think it helped. I mean, it helped to kind of disguise the problem, the fact that companies who are missing some sort of technical cadres could, they couldn't find it in the local labour market. They could just go abroad and find somebody. Or the person from abroad would find them. When you had such ease of free movement, it was relatively easy to sort out. I mean, we do have 5 million Europeans who have registered for either have automatic permanent residence or will acquire it in the next few years. So I mean, there is still a big sort of what Marx called the reserve army of labour from continental Europe that will be partly filling those jobs that our own education is no longer producing in sufficient numbers. I there was a story, I meant to follow it up, and I haven't seen it repeated, but I think in the kind of early crisis of our testing system in the pandemic, I think one of the reasons given was that we simply didn't have enough kind of white-coated technicians. We had lots of academic scientists, lots of those researchers you were talking about earlier, but not enough people who actually understood how the equipment works. Now, one way that employers have got around that is by placing graduates in those technician jobs. But there's some really interesting work. There's a guy called Paul Lewis at King's College London who's done some work on this, and how you then have a kind of mismatch of expectations. So, people who've done a degree, possibly even a further degree, end up doing those white-coated technician jobs, feel dissatisfied because of the expectations that they have for both higher salary, perhaps kind of more kind of intellectually stimulating work, and they find they're not, they prefer to be doing a white-coated technician job than no job at all, but it's not what they had been hoping for. And so they end up being not very good at it.
I was going to ask, why are the British people so uninterested in doing less hard, maybe it answers itself. Why are they not interested in doing less high status jobs? Everybody wants the highest status job.
Yeah, but I mean, it's partly because, I mean, this is what my book is about. It's partly because we've sort of so skewed the status argument, and I mean, it's just an old cliche, but it's true. That continental Europe, although it also suffers from the same sort of head, hand, heart status imbalances, I think it suffers from them less so far. Anyway, I mean, the Germanic countries, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands to some extent, still have very good options for school leavers who don't get into the academic stream. Same in Scandinavia, and that is partly because those, the handwerk, the skilled trades jobs still have a degree of respect. Perhaps, I mean, here you can get very well paid, but it's still, compared to a graduate job, somebody perhaps getting half the pay that you're getting as a plumber or electrician. There's still just not that status attached to it now, and perhaps this will change. I mean, I think it's going to have to change. I mean, that's one of the other things about this. My concept of peak head is that, I mean, I sort of had this epiphany in a way while I was writing the book, in that I started writing it thinking it was partly part two of The Road to Somewhere. So it was partly digging deeper into the value divide story, the Anywhere Somewhere story that I'd been writing about in The Road to Somewhere, trying to retrospectively explain the Brexit vote, to some extent the Trump vote, and the rise of populism in Europe through the lens of these partly educational-driven value divides. And I was digging deeper into that question, partly with Head, Hand, Heart, and looking at what I sort of think of in some ways as the elephant in the room, the fact that we have sort of diminished the status and regard attached to probably still a majority of the jobs and occupations that people do by telling people, from the time that they're a 10-year-old onwards, there is one route to success in our society. It's not just a matter of income, it's a matter of what it is to lead a successful life. You have to essentially be a graduate and go to an elite university and have a higher status professional job. And so that, as I say, was sort of, I mean, understanding that and understanding the resentments that new focus has inevitably created, because it's just logical. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody can do that. But sorry, to just sort of circle back to where I was. So my motivation was in Head, Hand, Heart was partly to dig deeper into this whole problem of the misallocation of status, or the over-allocation of status to one function, which has also contributed to that value divide that I talked about in The Road to Somewhere. But when I started writing, I was sort of thinking this is rather idealistic in a way. I mean, this idea. I mean, first of all, it's not in the gift of politics to distribute status around different kind of occupational groups, occupational abilities, as it were. So
where does status come from, and how can that be changed?
Well, let me come on to that. But I just want to finish this thought that while I was kind of researching, because this is a journalistic book, it's not a sort of scholarly work, so I was kind of researching it as I was writing it, and as I was writing it, I thought, having thought that this was kind of rather an idealistic notion of trying to distribute status more equally across these different functions, I actually came to think that this is kind of inevitable. It is going to have to happen because of this peak head concept. I mean, because the other side of the coin of peak head is we're not only overproducing sort of cognitively trained kids for jobs that are not there for them, and in any case going to be replaced by AI algorithms in the next few years. We're also underproducing people for the kind of middling technical jobs we've already talked about, and also the care jobs. Even before the pandemic, we had a shortage of 50,000 NHS nurses. We have a shortage of 100,000 people working in care homes. Now, not all those jobs are necessarily attractive ones. They're not very well paid ones. And we're going to have to do something about that. We're going to have to make them more attractive. And to some extent, status follows the money. So, you start paying people in care homes better, and I think the pandemic has helped in this respect. I mean, whatever happens on the pay side, and I'm sure they will get over time, their pay will rise relative to other comparable jobs. But they've been the kind of heroes and heroines of the crisis in many ways, both in the kind of mainstream health sector, in the hospital sector, but also in the care homes. And it's shone a light on them, and you can see that already. I mean, the increasing applications for people to do nursing courses, I think they've gone up 15 or 20%. And I very much doubt, the kind of hoo-ha about the 1% pay rise, which actually turns out to be quite a lot more than 1%, given the kind of incremental pay ladders in the NHS. I don't think that's going to put people off, because these things are partly about money, but not only about money. And I do think the whole thing about not just clapping for carers, but clapping for kind of key workers, and that, of course, some of that sort of the early idealism of the first lockdown may have dissipated somewhat, but I still think it'll linger on. I certainly, you go to the supermarket now and you kind of notice who is filling the shelves because you've realised what an incredibly important function it is. The kind of the people that maintain the hidden wiring of our lives have become less invisible, and I think that will linger on. And obviously that doesn't pay your bills, but being noted, being acknowledged as making an important contribution to our society, and the kind of recognition that we all have that we're that we're part of a sort of chain of dependency that includes the person that stacks the shelves in the supermarket. I think that is a positive thing that will come out of the pandemic, has come out of the pandemic, and we don't need to be clapping at our doorsteps to recognise that. I think, but it's something has shifted. I think in the kind of way we regard a lot of these jobs, and that must be a good thing.
I've been struck just in recent years by a lot of work that's been done on the subject of meaning and where people find meaning in their lives. And I don't know what your feeling is on Jordan Peterson, but he's clearly was on to something in that he was talking about how to find meaning in your life. And a lot of people responded to that very, very strongly. So regardless of whether or not he has any solutions, is this part of your thesis?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of say towards the end of Head, Hand, Heart how there's a sort of almost kind of religious, the quest for meaning. I write there's a whole chapter in the book which is partly about the loss of meaning. One of the most brilliant quotes that I use in the book at least a couple of times is the quote from Harari, Yuval Noah Harari, isn't it? About how, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but how in the modern world we've exchanged meaning for power. I think by power he means kind of power over nature, basically security and high standard of living. Our sort of scientific and technical power has given us that, but it's at the cost of stripping away, at the cost of creating disenchantment through, the modern scientific worldview has eliminated religion. It's eliminated magic and religion and meaning. Now, you can be an atheist and still have meaning in your life, but it's perhaps not automatic. It's something you have to work for, which is why Sam Harris has a meditation podcast as well as an ideas podcast.
Nobody more atheist than Sam Harris.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's my point. And, he has found, and I think many other people, it's not something I've really explored, but I do intend to. I mean, meditation and yoga and all these things are kind of alternative source of meaning for a post-religious age. Yeah, no, I think Peterson is very impressive. I couldn't quite understand why there was such a fuss about him. He's sort of somewhat small c conservative on some cultural issues. And I think it's a sort of testament to just how progressive, the sort of liberal progressive, the mainstream had become. The fact that he was regarded as a kind of extremist, which seemed to me crazy. To be quite honest, I haven't read either of his books. I do intend to read them. I've listened to some of his podcasts, which I found very impressive. I mean, prior to his illness, there was something slightly verging on the unhinged about him now.
Yeah.
I mean, he may recover from it, but there's a sort of there's something quite sort of tense about his something more sort of slightly desperate, as I say, about his presentation, which no doubt reflects the very difficult time he's been through. But no, I mean, I think his kind of intellectual range and vigor and self-confidence, I think, is incredibly impressive.
I saw him, for some reason, I saw him quite early on in his fame. I saw him in 2 lectures in London that he gave in some small church. And for some reason, I had tickets for both, about one Saturday and then I think it was the next day, maybe even the Sunday. And I can't remember why I had the 2 tickets, but I went twice, and he stood up and he gave his lecture extempore for an hour, and both lectures were completely different. He just talked about completely different things.
Mm.
And the most impressive thing, I mean, they were very interesting and enjoyable and challenging, but the most impressive thing was the Q&As. They had about 20 minutes of Q&A when people would ask questions about their own personal lives.
Mm.
And he was so empathic
Mm.
and helpful, and really made a difference to these people. It was one of the most impressive things I've seen. And I agree with you, it is very odd how everything's become so polarized, but I suppose his rise to fame came out of the gender pronouns issue. And I suppose that as the way society is a bit now, that once you're in a particular camp, the polarization and the divide just gets wider, as people wish to dissociate themselves or wish to associate themselves more and more. And so you end up being defined and seen through this one issue, where in actual fact, 95% of what you're about is somewhere completely different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's the sort of high intellectual of common sense, which is a sort of odd thing to be in a way. And I mean, of course, he came to my notice, came to many people's notice through his famous Channel 4 interview with Kathy Newman.
Yes.
And I mean, essentially all he was doing was sort of saying, look, men and women are equal, but they're not the same. And again, it's a testament to the extent to which common sense had adopted this completely uncommonsensical view, which is that men and women are completely the same. And that to challenge that seemed to be to challenge one of the foundation stones of modern liberalism, which is crazy.
But you talk a bit about that in your book as to how working women who have families, how society should best organize itself to allow them to bring up their families, without feeling hugely stressed.
Absolutely. And I think this is, I think, the modern women's movement has been very dominated by professional women, and the focus has been very much on equal competition with men in the professional sphere, which of course is completely right and proper and fair. But I think it has not at all represented the interests of a very large section of the female population who do not want to put professional life and career first. And I think feminism needs to be more pluralistic, and I think it's becoming so. Actually, I mean, a lot of voices, but people who would certainly call themselves feminists, like Madeline Bunting, who just written a very good book called Labours of Love, which is partly about this. And just have a look at opinion surveys. Opinion surveys consistently show that a majority, in many cases, a large majority of women would prefer to be able to spend more time at home when they have young children. Now, obviously, they want to be able to go back to work, and they want their professional achievements and qualifications to be maintained while taking a pause to focus on family life, and that ought to be possible. But I mean, we're pretty poor in international comparison when it comes to making that easy for people. One of the reasons why so many women with young children do have to go back to work so quickly is because their household requires it. And we give very little support. We don't allow parents of children to swap. What do I mean? I don't mean swap. Do I? To kind of use each other's tax exemptions. I mean, most other European countries, if one parent, usually but not always the mother, stays at home, they can transfer their tax allowance to the partner that goes out to work. So that would mean in this country you wouldn't pay any tax as a household with young children, with one partner staying at home. You wouldn't pay any tax until you earned more than 25 grand. You'd have a 25 grand, so you'd combine two 12.5 grand tax allowances.
I'm sure our tax system used to.
It did, it did, and when it took the long overdue step of giving independence to husbands and wives, there used to be that husbands used to get an extra tax allowance if they if they had a family. It was like a 50% extra, I think, and that disappeared. It was meant to be reinstated, but never got reinstated. That disappeared when husbands and wives were taxed independently, which was obviously completely appropriate. But it sort of disappeared, and I think actually that was an example. I think the female voice in national politics has become louder and louder in recent decades, but that was never seen as an issue worth making a big fuss about, because the female voice was so dominated by professional women who were who would have seen that perhaps as too much of an incentive for women to stay at home.
I wonder if part of the problem is actually linked into our property market, so that if you have enough, slightly bad term, but if enough women defect so that you have double income households, that double income household can afford a much better house in London than a single income household. So now that drives the other women to have to work also. So even though they may not wish to, they're more or less forced by the economic situation. And maybe to some extent that's driven by our rules on building property in England, which, it's everybody wants more houses, just nowhere near me, please. Not in Teddington, not in Hampstead, if you don't mind. Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation. Yeah, I mean, as you say, everything is sort of connected, isn't it? And yes, the fact that building regulations make it hard to build more houses and therefore bring down the average property price must have something to do with it. But if you want to, perhaps your first ambition as a family is to find a pleasant place to live, you then find that having found that pleasant place to live, you then have to work an unpleasant amount to stay there.
Yeah.
But we can help. Public policy can help on that, and it's not. And at the moment, it's definitely not helping enough. I think this government has sort of is more aware of it than previous governments, and and incidentally, this seems to be kind of it's something that both left and right. I mean, if we call Labour left and Tories right, which is perhaps not really completely appropriate any longer, but it's certainly. Conservatives have been no better in a sense on this issue up until now, anyway, than Labour.
But you talk about that in your book, don't you? The way that the Conservative and Labour, to some extent, seem to be changing sides, where the Labour is moving almost entirely towards head, and the Conservatives are much more representing what we would have called the working classes. Is this something that's going to go on?
It depends, I think. It depends on how well the Conservatives are able to represent their new voter base. I mean, this is something that's been happening for a few decades, but was given an extra big shove by Brexit, I think. By Brexit in the way that cultural issues came to dominate more traditionally economic issues. And because the Tories, notwithstanding what I was just saying on the issue of family, they've been kind of dragged along by the kind of liberal tide in some ways, but nonetheless, on many issues to do with kind of nation state and cultural identity and so on, and that the Tories are obviously a more comfortable home for more small c conservative feelings than Labour, who've become very kind of liberal, progressive, universalist, graduate base of their activists and MPs, and indeed an increasing proportion of their voters are liberal-minded graduates. And to that extent, the Tories are far more representative of the whole country. They also have kind of affluent graduate core vote, but they have a higher representation amongst people at the bottom of the social pile. So that Labour is increasingly graduates and some ethnic minorities, and the Tories have a kind of better spread across the whole population. And so they have an opportunity, I think, to sort of bed in a sort of social democratic Toryism that represents the economic interests of the left behind, and the whole levelling up, the very phrase "levelling up" is a symbol of that and their desire to do that. I think the only thing that Labour can do is stand by and catch the voters who become disillusioned if and when they fail to do that. If they fail to represent both their new... it's a difficult balancing act for them. They don't want to abandon the comfortable middle classes either. And to some extent, the interests of these two groups are in tension. They have to find a way of... it's easy enough to find cultural common ground, perhaps between those two groups, the more conservative-minded, affluent Southerners and the more conservative-minded working-class Northerners or Midlanders. It's harder to find the economic common ground, but again, that's partly been disguised by the pandemic, because they've been forced into a kind of New Deal conservatism, whether they like it or not. But I think electoral logic will force them to stay with, to continue to seek that balance. Russell, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go.
When we arranged this, you said that you would have to go at 12:15, and we've reached 12:15, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much, David, for coming on the podcast and talking to me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. Okay,
so what's the next book?
I don't know, really. Perhaps something around these sort of family issues. That's, it's a hot potato, but I think a good one too, a good potato.
Okay, well, thanks very much, and
all right.
Best of luck. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.